Blackhawks training camp opens up in just a couple of hours. I'll break down Wyatt Kaiser finally signing a new deal and all the key storylines to watch throughout camp.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman, also Blackhawks beat writer for Chicago Hockey Now. Can go and check me out on X at Jack Bushman 2, but make sure to follow my strictly Blackhawks account at Talkin' Hockey to get all of the latest Blackhawks news and updates. And I also got to let you know that today's episode is sponsored by FanDuel. Go and download the FanDuel app or visit FanDuel.com today to get $300 worth of bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. All right, Blackhawks fans, the day has finally arrived. Blackhawks training camp begins later on this morning down at Fifth Third Arena in Chicago. Could not be more excited to get on down there and see Blackhawks hockey back in action. But I'm up early here this morning. It's currently 5 a.m. Central Time to break down all of the biggest training camp storylines and position battles to watch when things open up in just a couple of hours. But before I get into that, do got to touch on Wyatt Kaiser finally agreeing to a new contract here with Chicago. Took a little bit longer than I think any of us anticipated, but as I had been reporting on the show these last couple of days, the two sides, both of them wanted to reach a new deal before training camp begun. They didn't want Kaiser to miss any time starting the season behind the eight ball, and they've now avoided a holdout by agreeing to a 2-year contract extension that runs through the 26-27 season, carrying a $1.7 million cap hit, which honestly was lower than I was initially expecting, Blackhawks fans. And just to be honest, the RFA situation has kind of confused me this summer. And while I understand Kaiser didn't have arbitration rights as an RFA here, that's why things dragged out to this point. And Arvid Soderblom did have arbitration rights. That makes for two very different situations. Obviously, Soderblom's a goaltender. Kaiser's a defenseman, two different positions. But for Soderblom to get $2.75 million on his next deal and for Kaiser to only get $1.7, while Kaiser, both players still feel a little bit unproven. Soderblom has obviously been up in the NHL for the last couple of years now, but for Kaiser to get over $1 million less than Arvid Soderblom, that surprised me a little bit, and I don't think this was the contract that Kaiser's camp was necessarily looking for on this next deal, especially with the term. From what I had been hearing, it sounded like they wanted a little more of a long-term commitment, but quite honestly, this is a deal that's going to work out well for Kaiser also because it is a short-term bridge deal that's going to allow him to be back on the free agent market and potentially capitalize on his play in just a couple of years' time. He'll still only be 25 years old when this new deal expires, so he's going to be just fine. It puts him in a position, again, to kind of bet on himself a little bit and go and make more money on his next deal. But also, just considering the Blackhawks' defensive position as a whole, and how much they still have to learn about so many young players and which guys, for sure are going to be part of the long-term picture, they don't know enough about Kaiser still as part of that and this defense as a whole, I think, to give him that long-term commitment. So that's why I always kind of assumed it was going to be a shorter-term bridge deal. I did believe that's what currently made the most sense for both sides, and that's what we winded up seeing for the 23-year-old Kaiser, who, just as kind of a quick recap on what he's been up to since reaching the professional scene or since joining the Blackhawks organization, third-round pick back in 2020, played 3 years of college hockey with the University of Minnesota Duluth. First saw him on the NHL scene in March of 2023 after signing his entry-level contract. Appeared in 9 NHL games that season, tallying 3 assists and burning the first year of his contract. And then he actually opened up the 23-24 season on the NHL roster, but never really found his footing out of the gate, ultimately got sent back down to the AHL where he'd spend the remainder of the season. But this last year was definitely when we started to see Kaiser piece it all together. He played in a career-high 57 NHL games, tallying career bests in goals, points, block shots, and hits, 4 goals 8 points on the year. In total now, that gives Kaiser 98 games with 18 points, 4 goals, and 14 assists. And like I said, while especially in the final 22 games last season after being recalled from Rockford, he definitely showed his most complete play when up in the NHL. And it did seem like he was finally starting to turn a corner. 3 of the 4 goals that he scored last year came in those final 22 games. Also chipped in for 2 assists during that stretch and played more than 19 minutes 13 times. So yeah, we did get a sign of what could be to come for Wyatt Kaiser, but again, it still wasn't in the greatest sample size in only 98 NHL games. Never played more than 57 games in a single season. That's why I wasn't surprised to see these two sides wind up signing that shorter term bridge deal, because again, I just didn't think it would make a lot of sense at this point in time to give Wyatt Kaiser that long-term commitment, even if it would have been for like a team-friendly price at $2.1, $2.2, $2.5 million or something along those lines. I still feel like the commitment in terms of the length, I don't know if Kyle Davidson would have been comfortable giving that out right now, but definitely excited to know that Kaiser isn't going to be missing any time at training camp. I didn't think it was going to take until 8:30 p.m. Central Time, the day prior to training camp beginning, but happy that these two sides have finally sparked an agreement. But definitely interested to see now that Kaiser does have a deal, which I expected all along, as I've said. But now I'm really curious to see what is going to be happening with Matt Grzelcyk, who signed a PTO earlier on this week. But there's obviously no shortage of left-handed defensemen in the system. We know Alex Vlasic is going to be on that top pairing. It feels likely that Kaiser is going to be the second pairing left-handed defenseman to begin the season. I expected Ethan Del Mastro to be in that third pairing left-handed defenseman role, but there's obviously still Kevin Korchinski. There's obviously Nolan Allen. And then there's Matt Grzelcyk too, who, as I mentioned, could potentially be an option for the Blackhawks on the right-hand side. I don't know how serious they are considering giving Grzelcyk an NHL deal. Maybe it was just part of a ploy to get Kaiser to sign this new contract. But as I talked about a couple of days ago when breaking down the Grzelcyk situation, I do wonder if this could impact a defenseman like Artem Levshinov, just because I went back and looked at the Blackhawks roster on Puckpedia. And when I talked a couple of days ago, I said, well, if Grzelcyk were to get an NHL contract, he were to be part of the group out of the gate for the Blackhawks, which defenseman that we expected to be on the opening night roster, which of those defensemen would most likely be the odd man out? And I said, I don't think it's going to be Wyatt Kaiser. I don't think it's going to be Ethan Del Mastro either, but it probably would be between either him or Artem Levshinov. Well, one wrinkle I forgot to mention in that is Ethan Del Mastro is not waivers exempt. He would have to go through waivers in order to be sent to Rockford, I believe. And the Blackhawks would not want to risk losing him for free. I don't think they'd want to risk losing Louis Crevier for free, while Sam Rinzel, Kevin Korchinski, and Artem Levshinov are all still eligible to go through waivers. So that is definitely something to consider. If Matt Grzelcyk winds up getting an NHL deal, it might wind up being Artem Levshinov as the odd man out, just because they don't want to risk sending Ethan Del Mastro through waivers. And also with Del Mastro being older and more experienced than Levshinov, kind of in the same boat as Wyatt Kaiser, right? I think they're both ready to be full-time NHLers. I do think the same for Levshinov. I think he can handle an NHL role, but I do feel like he's still got to prove that over these next couple of weeks before the regular season officially begins on October 7th against the Florida Panthers. Could mean nothing though, Blackhawks fans. There is a decent chance that Matt Grzelcyk doesn't wind up signing an NHL deal, and we see Artem Levshinov on this opening night roster, which would give the Blackhawks 6 of their 7 defensemen being under the age of 25 years old, with Connor Murphy being the lone exception. We're going to have to see how it all winds up playing out this week at Blackhawks training camp. But speaking of training camp, coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, make sure to stick with me as I'll break down the biggest training camp storylines to watch over the next 19 days. But first, I do quickly got to show some love to one of today's sponsors, which is FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready for kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Because right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use all across the app. And what I personally love about FanDuel is that it's super quick, it's easy, and the best way to add a little more energy to your Sundays. with player props, same game parlays, and now more ways than ever to get in on the action. Are you ready to play? All you got to do is download the FanDuel app or visit fanduel.com today in order to get started. Again, that's the FanDuel app or fanduel.com to place your first $5 bet and get $300 in bonus bets when it wins. Segment 2, with training camp starting up here later this morning, Blackhawks fans definitely had to go through all the key and notable training camp storylines, as well as position battles in segment 3 to watch here over the next 19 days before the Blackhawks jump on that plane and head on down to South Florida. The number one storyline, I think, to watch as training camp begins here is Jeff Blashill's impact in his tendencies. And the reason I say that is because it's been so long since the Blackhawks had a head coach with NHL experience. It's been since Joe Quenneville when he was fired back in November of 2018. Obviously, Jeremy Colleton, not a name, I like bringing up and reminding Blackhawks fans of, but he, Derek King, Luke Richardson, and Anders Sorensen have been the last 4 to fill the head coaching role in the Blackhawks organization. All of them first-time NHL bench bosses. And it's not like Blashill has tons of NHL head coaching experience, right? He only has one previous stint in that position. However, it was for 7 years with the Detroit Red Wings. And I think it's also noteworthy that the Red Wings were going through a rebuild during the majority of Blashill's tenure there, like the Blackhawks are going through right now. And I think kind of those parallels and his familiarity and experience with that type of situation definitely played a part in him landing his new gig here in Chicago. But altogether, I just want to see the tone and the message and how Blashill is going to go about things right from that first whistle here this morning, because it's a new era. He's got to set that tone, and there's got to be changes made from top to bottom for the Blackhawks to get where they want to go. And I'm just really curious to see how Blashill's expertise, his experience in this situation is going to impact, key young players like Connor Bedard, who I'll get to here in just a second, like Frank Nazar, like Sam Rinzel, and even some key returning veterans, right? Like Tyler Bertuzzi, Teuvo Teravainen, Ryan Donato. How is he going to get the most out of each and every one of those guys? How is he going to kind of prioritize the development of the young players with getting veterans the looks that they deserve to be looking and putting them in the best position to help the team succeed? I'm very interested to also see, line combinations and defensive pairings, obviously, as there's been lots of chatter about all of these potential roles for the Blackhawks team here so far this season. And then just the mentality and the mindset that the team is going to bring to the table. We'll probably see more, of how this all plays out when when the preseason begins, and now just 5 days time, Blackhawks fans, next Tuesday against the Detroit Red Wings. But I'm just excited to see Blashill's impact on all these players, how he's going to run a practice, what the vibe and the intensity level is going to be. And when Blashill spoke with the media last back in August, he kind of outlined some of the tendencies, some of the offensive and defensive zone systems that he wants to run. I think that's a big part of it as well. He mentioned, hard work ethic, winning habits. Those are things he wants to instill into this team really early on in camp. It sounds like he wants to open things up with a back checking system that he wants to implement, which again is just kind of a hard work indicator is what he referred to it as, just to kind of, again, set that baseline for what the expectations are all throughout training camp. But also talked about how he wants his defensemen to be more involved in the rush, and that's kind of the same idea, same mentality that Anders Sorensen utilized when he was the interim head coach in the second half of the season for the Blackhawks, where we saw this offense have a much higher upside, much bigger ceiling, and, mobile defensemen like Wyatt Kaiser, who I just talked about. He found his footing in those final 22 games. Sam Rinzel looked really sharp at the end of the season. So it's just continuing to use what naturally helps this team get better. We have a lot of big skating defensemen on the back end. I love to hear that Blashill wants to kind of utilize those guys to help turn defense into offense. So he gave us kind of a expectation of what's going to go down here when things begin, but I'm just excited to see those systems put into place. And again, the impact that he's going to make on this team as the Blackhawks are getting their first experienced NHL head coach in nearly a decade. So that's what I'm going to be looking at throughout training camp as well as the preseason as well, to see how this team fares under Blashill as a second stint head coach. I think also a super noteworthy storyline to follow throughout Blackhawks training camp is Connor Bedard's growth. Bedard, I think, is off to just, a fine start to his NHL career. Back-to-back 60-point seasons, leading point scorer for the Blackhawks as an 18, 19-year-old, 20 goals in both of those seasons with not a lot of help around him, right? Playing for one of the worst teams in hockey, handling the situation, being a generational talent labeled as that, while also getting drafted by an original six franchise and doing a lot of losing through his first two seasons. Altogether, I think Connor Bedard has handled that really well. But make no mistake about it, there are still things he has to improve upon. There is still growth that needs to happen in his game for him to take that next step, to reach the next level and become an NHL superstar. And I'm not only really curious to see how Blashill is going to aid in him taking that next step, but I'm also just really curious to see how Bedard is going to look after another summer of off-season training, which according to Bedard himself, he said he really focused on speed in particular over the summer. And that awareness I absolutely love, because I really do believe the biggest thing holding Bedard back at this point in time, aside from having true top line capable line mates, it's the lack of top level speed. Now, he is a good skater. He's good on his edges to go and change angles and to change directions really fast. And I think he pairs that with really good stick handling to help fool defenders and create open space for himself to make plays happen. But the top level foot speed is still lacking. And one of the most, if not the most, necessary trait, I feel like, in the modern day NHL to be a superstar, because the game is just faster than ever. Basically, everyone who's inside the top six these days can skate. And comparing Bedard to like Nathan McKinnon, Connor McDavid, obviously, and even to like an Austin Matthews in some sense, the speed still isn't at the top level. There's definitely another stride for him to get to if he wants to take that jump in his game. So I love to hear that Bedard recognize that first and foremost from his first two NHL seasons, and then put a lot of work in that department over the summer. Really excited to see if he's going to look faster on the ice and what kind of additional changes or improvements he's made throughout the course of the summer. And then also just want to see Bedard's game altogether, how it looks compared to from year two compared to year three. And then also the defensive side of things, right? Not only is there still things for him to get better at to be a full-time center in terms of defensive responsibilities, but he's also got to improve at the faceoff dot as well. It's worth pointing out, new assistant coach Michael Pekka for the Blackhawks, two-time Selke Trophy winner, worked with the New York Rangers the last 2 years as an assistant and was in charge of the faceoff duties. Did a good job in helping the Rangers team faceoff percentage take a nice leap. Hopefully, Pekka will be able to have the same success with not only just Connor Bedard, but a young center iceman like Frank Nazar as well, who both still have some ways to go at the faceoff dot here. But all eyes will be on Connor Bedard, as they always are, in addition to the type of growth in leaps he's made in his game from year two to year three. Speaking of Frank Nazar, definitely one of the biggest storylines in Blackhawks training camp as well is Frank Nazar being a full-time NHLer for the first time. And it's expected that he's going to be in the second line center role to open up the season. If Frank Nazar can build off of where he left off last year and what he did to help the United States win a gold medal at the World Championship this summer, if he can be a key, consistent piece of offense for this Blackhawks team, and boy, have they been lacking consistent contributions from any other line except the top line during the Connor Bedard era. If Frank Nazar can provide that and provide consistent two-way play and be a special player on the penalty kill, utilizing his wheels and his hustle in lots of different ways, like we've already seen from him at the NHL level, but just in a full-time season, then it's going to give this Blackhawks team more upside than I think people expect. And I just feel like it also makes for the possibility of this being a lot more fun season for the Blackhawks than we've seen in quite a while if Bedard and Nazar can establish a true 1-2 punch of the future down the middle for the Blackhawks. So Connor Bedard and Frank Nazar, no surprise, two of the biggest storylines to keep an eye on here during training camp, as well as Jeff Blashill's impact. I'm also really curious to see what's going to happen with Lukas Reichel, not only in terms of the trade rumors picking back up here again, and Elliot Friedman saying it's pretty known that Reichel's available at this point in time. The player even probably knows it's kind of reached that time. But I still think Reichel is probably going to open up the regular season on the Blackhawks roster. I just feel like the Blackhawks likely want an NHL player in return, someone who can help this team right now, and I just don't really see another team giving that up. The likely return, I feel like, would be a second or third round pick for Reichel, and the Blackhawks just don't really need that. I think they would rather give Reichel this opportunity to go and prove himself. Even if it doesn't work out, they'll know for sure one way or the other if he's a part of their future. It's also a fresh start for him under new head coach Jeff Blashill. I just don't think it would be worth it to sell low on Lukas Reichel at this point, and if they do trade him, that's what I feel like they'd probably be doing, because I don't think there would be a suitor willing to give a true NHL helping piece right now in exchange for Reichel. But if he does stay with the Blackhawks, it's going to be fascinating to see what his role is to open up training camp and to open up the regular season, because it's probably not going to be in the top six once again. He's likely to open things up down in the bottom six, where he hasn't really found any success at all so far in his NHL career. So interested to see what's going to give here with Lukas Reichel. Will they give him an opportunity on the third line? Is he going to be a healthy scratch? Does he wind up getting traded, which would surprise me, but I'm not ruling it out. Lukas Reichel, key storyline for the Blackhawks here during training camp as well. Another key storyline, Spencer Knight as a full-time number one goaltender being handed the keys in net for the first time in his NHL career. He had been Sergei Bobrovsky's backup for the majority of his tenure with the Florida Panthers, but now it's Knight's opportunity to show us what he's got. He's been considered a high-level goaltender prospect for the last handful of years, former 13th overall selection. Now, as a 24-year-old, it's his time to show us what he can do as a number one goaltender. Of course, signed a 3-year contract extension just last week. Excited to see how Spencer Knight is going to fare in that number one role. Speaking of goaltenders, one of the key Blackhawks training camp storylines, I think, is whether Laurent Brossoit can get healthy, which, listen, I'm not expecting him to do, given how things have gone so far in his time with the Blackhawks. Certainly not expecting it or thinking it's going to happen anytime soon, but you never know. And if Brossoit is able to get healthy, that adds a very interesting layer to the Blackhawks goaltender position, because while it seems pretty clear cut for Knight and Soderblom to be the number one and number two, if Brossoit were to be healthy, then you got to consider 3 goaltenders being on the NHL roster. Even if you want to trade Laurent Brossoit, you probably have to give him reps in net to show other teams. I mean, he hasn't played a game for, nearly 2 full seasons. So it's like other teams are going to want to see what he has to offer. So it would just make a very complicated situation for the Blackhawks if Laurent Brossoit is healthy. It could, give the Blackhawks a much better duo in net, considering how good Brossoit has been when healthy in his career. And Knight and Brossoit would definitely be a stronger tandem than Knight and Soderblom. The problem is just hard to expect Laurent Brossoit being healthy. We'll see if that winds up popping up at all throughout training camp. And then last but certainly not least, the last key storyline that I wanted to bring up before diving into some key position battles is just which young players in general make the most of the opportunity. There's lots of forwards gunning for an NHL roster spot with only few jobs available. Same with things on the defensive side of things. It is very clogged up on the Blackhawks blue line. Which of those players who are right there on the bubble makes the most of the opportunity? And then in addition to those guys, who's going to be the AJ Spellacy from last year? Who's going to kind of turn some heads and maybe stick around for longer than anyone anticipated? Who is going to be that level of prospect for the Blackhawks? It seems like there's always one surprise throughout training camp. Interested to see who it's going to be, like I said, for both the bubble players and also the rest of the prospects in the Blackhawks organization. But there are the top storylines to watch throughout Blackhawks training camp. Coming up in just a moment, Hawks fans, before I close things out, still want to dive into some key position battles ensuing over the next 19 days. Real quick, though, I do also got to talk to you all about Monarch Money. Most people can't name all of their financial accounts or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. But that's where Monarch Money comes in, an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, super easy-to-use interface, both available on your laptop and on your phone. And Monarch does all of the heavy lifting for you, so you can link all of your accounts in minutes, see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of your spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever having to touch a spreadsheet. So don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks any longer. Go and use the promo code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps at monarchmoney.com, and you'll also get half off on your first year. Again, that's 50% off on your first year at monarchmoney.com when you use our promo code LOCKEDONNHL in all caps. Real quick, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen here to start off your day. For your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On NHL podcast, where there is no offseason, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter the most with the local coverage you love from Locked On. And you can now find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Segment 3, last but certainly not least, wanted to bring up some key position battles that are going to be happening internally for the Blackhawks. As I just referenced to close out segment 2, there's going to be a lot of young forwards gunning for only a few available positions. There's a huge logjam on the back end that didn't get any easier considering the addition of Matt Grzelcyk on a PTO. So definitely wanted to dive through all the competition that's going to be going on here over these next couple of weeks. First and foremost, in terms of position battles, who are going to be Connor Bedard's line mates? It feels like the top 6 for the Blackhawks is pretty cut and dry considering Ryan Donato, Teuvo Teravainen, and Tyler Bertuzzi are all returning. Obviously, Bedard and Nazar, the Blackhawks are rolling with them as their first and second line centers to open up the season. That only leaves one other top 6 forward spot available, and I think it likely goes to Andre Burakovsky. The only other roster players who I feel like could be in that conversation are Ilya Mikheyev, and the only reason I say that is because he performed pretty well when getting a chance along with Connor Bedard on the top line last year, but naturally more of a third line checking role type of guy. That's where I'm expecting him to be to open up the year. So that's why I fully believe Burakovsky, the newcomer from the Seattle Kraken, is probably going to be the 6th and final top 6 piece. Nick Lardis is maybe one guy who can kind of go and shake up all of these plans with a real strong showing in the preseason and training camp. But again, more likely than not that he's going to be opening things up in the AHL. But while the top 6 is, like I said, pretty cut and dry, there's still a question of who's going to be the wings for Bedard on the top line and who are going to be the wings for Nazar on the second line. For me personally, I think Ryan Donato, considering the type of season that he had last year, and he was the one who, out of all the Blackhawks forwards, he was the one who played the most along with Bedard and definitely capitalized on the opportunity most. Career season for Donato, 31 goals, new career high, 62 points, new career high, 31 assists, new career high. He definitely made the most of that chance and I think is deserving of opening up training camp in that same position. It feels like he deserves to be in a position where it's his job to lose. And then also he fared really well along with Bedard. I thought those two established some good chemistry, and Donato's two-way prowess along with, his ability to get to the front of the net and go to the dirty areas on top of the uptick in speed that he's added to his game in these last couple of years. I do think that makes him the natural selection along with Bedard in one of those two wing spots. Fully expect Ryan Donato to be in that position. The other wing spot, though, is, in my opinion, a little more complicated. I think Teuvo Teravainen would be my top option. I just think out of the other 3 guys, he's probably the most all-around talented player. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they put Andre Burakovsky there just because of his size and his speed along with his goal scoring, even though haven't really seen it in a couple of years since he left the Colorado Avalanche organization. That is normally a strength of his game, and with Bedard being a right-hand shot, Burakovsky being a left, maybe that's the way that Jeff Blashill wants to go about things. Bertuzzi obviously is another option, like I said, but he did not really play whatsoever along with Bedard last year. And they had like a good 3-week stretch in right around Christmas time when Bertuzzi finally got a chance on that top line, but didn't wind up sticking there in those final couple of months. I'm expecting it to be Ryan Donato, and if I had to guess, I'm going with Teuvo Teravainen, but it still feels like it's very up in the air in terms of Connor Bedard's line mates, but I'm going to go with Bertuzzi and Burakovsky on the second line with Nazar, Teravainen, and Donato up on the top line with Connor Bedard. Then that takes us to the bottom six. Who wins the bottom six jobs for the Blackhawks? I first got to point out Mikheyev, Dickinson, Foligno, they're all going to be back in bottom six roles. They're going to be lineup regulars for the Blackhawks this year. So there goes 3 of those 6 lineup spots, 8 roster spots. Then you got Sam Lafferty, who's going to be an NHLer for the Blackhawks as he's back once again. Lucas Reichel, if he doesn't wind up getting traded, he's going to be part of the NHL group. So that's 5 of the 6 bottom 6 lineup spots to begin the season. Doesn't leave a whole heck of a lot of room for guys like Colton Dach, Landon Slaggert, Oliver Moore, Ryan Green, Nick Lardis, as I mentioned as well. Samuel Savoie potentially in that mix too. It feels like there's really only room for 1 or 2 of those guys. And also, you probably don't want to be, for someone like Oliver Moore and Ryan Green and maybe even Dach and Slaggert in a sense as well, even though those 2 guys are older and more experienced, you probably don't want those guys like consistently being healthy scratch. You'd probably just prefer them playing top line roles in all situations for the Rockford Ice Hogs. So I'm really interested to see who of this group is going to wind up making the roster. I think Moore is clearly the most talented. He has the best speed, and I think he's above Ryan Green based on what happened at the Tom Curvers Prospect Showcase. But I do feel like Colton Dach's mold and his physicality, that fits what the Blackhawks need down on their third and the fourth line the most. Maybe Moore could fit in really well with Mikheyev and Dickinson on a checking role, but I think as a physical forward, and the Blackhawks really don't have any of these on their roster, Colton Dach could fill such an important need for this team. So that's why I think Dach might have a leg up. But all 4 of those players vying for just 1 or 2 available spots on the Blackhawks opening night roster. Who's going to be winning those final jobs? And then same thing on the defensive side of things, right? Alex Vlasic, we know he's going to be on the roster. Same with Connor Murphy. Sam Renzel at this point in time seems pretty gosh darn likely to be on the top pairing with Vlasic. But outside of those 3, the other 4 defenseman spots are pretty open. I expect it to go to Kaiser, Del Mastro, Crevier, and Levshinov, but like I said, things are not set in stone by any means, and Matt Grzelcyk makes the matters more complicated. If Kevin Korchinski has a standout training camp or preseason, that makes things a lot more interesting. So who are going to be the young forwards that sneak onto this NHL roster, and who are going to be the young defensemen that round out the Blackhawks blue line? That is everything to keep an eye out for as training camp begins down at Fifth Third Arena later this morning. Could not be more excited to jump on the train here soon to get on down there. That's going to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks, everyone. As always, thank you all again for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free, wherever you may be listening to your podcast, and to subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube. That way you don't miss out on any of the latest episodes. I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Follow me on X at JackBushman2. Check out my strictly Blackhawks account, Talkin' Hockey, so you don't miss out on any of the latest Blackhawks news and updates. Until the next episode, everyone, enjoy the rest of your Thursdays. Enjoy the opening day of Blackhawks training camp. Kyle Davidson's going to be having a media availability, going to be having a media session later on this morning as well. Lots of quotes coming your way. I'll talk about it on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.